Just stay out of sight tonight, Eleanor. That dress is embarrassing. Richard whispered sharply as the valet opened the car door beneath the glittering lights of the Hilton Grand Ballroom. Eleanor Whitman did not answer. She smoothed the fabric over her waist, a navy silk gown she had owned for years, tailored carefully to fit her still straight posture and quiet grace, and stepped out into the cool October air as if he had said nothing at all. The marble steps shimmered under crystal chandeliers, and executives in tuxedos moved past her in polished waves of confidence, their laughter rising into the evening like champagne bubbles. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, already scanning the entrance for the new CEO everyone had been talking about, a billionaire investor who had recently acquired controlling interest in the firm. For weeks Richard had spoken of nothing else at dinner, rehearsing talking points between bites of steak, calculating potential promotions, polishing stories that made him sound indispensable. Tonight, Eleanor understood, she was not his partner. She was an accessory, something to be hidden if necessary. She followed him inside, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, taking in the towering floral arrangements and the orchestra tuning their instruments beneath golden balconies. 32 years of marriage had trained her to recognize the rhythm of Richard's ambition. When he felt small, he expanded loudly. When he felt threatened, he minimized whatever stood beside him. Over the years that had often been her, he drifted away from her within seconds, clasping hands, laughing too heartily, positioning himself where cameras flashed. Eleanor remained near the edge of the ballroom, beside a towering oil painting of a coastal harbor, watching servers carry trays of sparkling water and champagne. She folded her hands loosely in front of her, composed, almost invisible, exactly as instructed. A few women glanced at her dress, understated compared to the sequin gowns swirling across the dance floor, but no one lingered long enough to measure her worth. Richard caught her eye once from across the room and gave a subtle motion of his hand, as if reminding her to stay planted where she was. She complied without protest. What no one in that ballroom knew, not even her husband, was that Eleanor had once belonged easily in rooms like this. Before marriage, before moving to the suburbs, before trading gallery openings for PDA meetings, she had studied art history in Boston and spent a summer interning at a design firm that specialized in branding luxury developments. She had possessed ideas once, bright and bold, sketches that had made men twice her age nod in approval. Those years felt distant now, packed carefully away like old photographs. A ripple moved through the crowd near the entrance. Conversations softened. Heads turned. The billionaire had arrived. Richard straightened instantly, smoothing his tie, stepping forward with practiced confidence. Eleanor did not move. She watched as the tall figure in a tailored black tuxedo entered the ballroom, silver at his temples, posture commanding yet unhurried. The orchestra quieted. Glasses paused midair. Richard approached him first, extending his hand with a polished smile. But before the two men connected, the billionaire's gaze shifted past Richard's shoulder, past the cluster of executives, and landed directly on Eleanor. And for the first time that evening, she felt seen. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Daniel Hayes stepped fully into the light, and Richard's extended hand hovered awkwardly in the air for a fraction of a second too long. Eleanor felt the shift before she understood it, a subtle current running through the crowd as attention redirected itself without permission. Daniel's eyes did not waver. He did not scan the room for the most powerful executive or the loudest voice. He looked at her as if no one else existed. Richard followed his gaze slowly, confusion flickering across his face before he attempted to recover his composure with a polite chuckle that sounded thinner than he intended. Eleanor remained still beside the painting, her hands folded, her chin lifted just slightly, unsure whether she had imagined the intensity of that stare. Daniel took a step forward, then another, leaving behind the cluster of senior partners who had been waiting to greet him. The orchestra resumed a quiet melody, but the notes felt distant, as if muffled by the sudden weight in the air. Eleanor became aware of her own heartbeat, steady but firm, echoing in her ears. Richard shifted position, attempting to intercept the path, but Daniel moved past him with an apologetic nod that carried more authority than any introduction could have offered. Conversations began again in hushed tones, though eyes continued to follow the unfolding scene. Eleanor could see the questions forming in Richard's expression. He glanced at her dress, then back at the approaching figure, as if recalculating the entire evening in real time. When Daniel finally stood before her, close enough for her to notice the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, he did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and recognition that softened his otherwise commanding presence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor felt the past pressing gently against her memory, something familiar in the way he carried himself, the cadence of his breath, the shape of his brow. It was like seeing a photograph restored after decades in a drawer. Richard cleared his throat behind them, attempting to reclaim the narrative. He began to introduce his wife in a tone that suggested ownership rather than partnership, but Daniel lifted a hand slightly, not dismissive, simply certain. The gesture was enough to quiet him. Eleanor sensed dozens of eyes resting on her shoulders now, measuring, reassessing. She did not shrink. She did not rush to explain. She met Daniel's gaze with calm restraint, allowing him the space to speak first. Whatever was about to unfold did not feel accidental. It felt like something that had been waiting patiently for 30 years, standing just outside the edges of her carefully constructed life, ready to step back in at precisely this moment. Daniel Hayes finally spoke her name, and the sound of it seemed to travel across decades before settling gently between them. Eleanor Blake, he said quietly, not as a question but as recognition, and the old surname felt unfamiliar and intimate at the same time. Eleanor felt a subtle tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from the sudden collision of memory and present reality. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in more than 30 years. Richard shifted again behind her, clearly unsettled now, attempting to piece together a history he had never bothered to ask about. Daniel took another small step forward, his voice steady but softened by emotion. He spoke of a summer in Boston, of a modest studio near the harbor where a young woman had sketched logos on tracing paper late into the night, convinced that ideas mattered more than titles. Eleanor felt the ballroom fade around them, the polished floors and crystal chandeliers dissolving into the scent of salt air and fresh ink. She remembered the narrow desk by the window, the cheap coffee that kept her awake, the ambition that once burned brightly in her chest. Daniel spoke of those sketches, of a particular design built around intersecting lines that symbolized resilience and clarity. He admitted that years later, when he founded his first company, he had adapted that very concept into the foundation of his brand. The emblem now displayed on banners throughout the ballroom had been born from her pencil strokes. A quiet murmur moved through the guests as they began to understand the implication. Richard's face drained of color, his earlier confidence dissolving into forced composure. Eleanor did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Daniel, searching his expression for exaggeration or nostalgia, but found only sincerity. He explained that after she left Boston abruptly, he had searched for her through mutual contacts and old addresses, only to learn that she had married and relocated. He had respected her choice, he said, but he had never forgotten the brilliance she carried or the kindness she showed when he was struggling. His voice grew slightly unsteady as he admitted that success had come at a cost, and that some names lingered longer than profits or headlines. The orchestra continued to play softly, though the music felt distant compared to the gravity of his confession. Eleanor became aware of the way people were watching her now, not with indifference, but with curiosity and new respect. She felt no urge to dramatize the moment. She did not reach for Daniel's hands or collapse into sentiment. Instead, she stood tall, absorbing the reality that the part of herself she believed had been forgotten had in fact endured in ways she never imagined. Richard attempted to laugh lightly and suggest they all discuss this over drinks, but the attempt sounded hollow. Daniel's attention never left Eleanor. In that suspended space beneath the chandelier light, she understood something with startling clarity. The narrative of her life had never been as small as she had allowed it to become. Silence settled over the small circle that had formed around them, but it was not the awkward silence of confusion. It was the charged stillness that comes when a truth finally steps into the light. Eleanor felt the weight of the past resting gently on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as confirmation. She had not imagined those years. In Boston, she had not exaggerated her own promise. Daniel continued, his voice steady. explaining how that original design had become the cornerstone of Hayes Global's identity, refined over time, but always rooted in the intersecting lines she once sketched at a narrow wooden desk. Large banners bearing that emblem hung from the ballroom balcony, illuminated in gold, a silent testament to something she had created long before she understood her own value. Around them, executives exchanged surprised glances. Some began whispering to one another, recalibrating their assumptions about the woman who had been standing quietly near the painting only minutes earlier. Richard forced a smile and attempted to place a hand lightly on Eleanor's back, but the gesture felt performative, almost rehearsed. She sensed it without turning. For decades, she had recognized the difference between support and strategy. Daniel shifted his focus briefly to Richard, acknowledging him with polite composure, yet his attention returned almost immediately to Eleanor. He spoke of the early years when his first venture nearly collapsed, of nights when doubt threatened to overtake him, and how he would revisit her old sketches as reminders that vision required patience. Eleanor listened carefully, her posture unbroken. She did not rush to claim credit or diminish the story with false modesty. Instead, she allowed the facts to stand on their own. The orchestra transitioned into a slower arrangement, and servers resumed circulating with trays of sparkling water and champagne, though many guests were too absorbed in the unfolding moment to notice. Richard attempted again to steer the conversation toward business, suggesting potential partnerships, but his words seemed to slide past the gravity of what had just been revealed. Eleanor felt a subtle shift inside herself, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The years she had spent accommodating Richard's ambitions, minimizing her own contributions, and accepting smaller spaces now appeared in sharper contrast. She remembered evenings in their suburban home when she had mentioned returning to design work, only to be met with practical discouragement about timing or finances. She had believed compromise was the language of marriage. Standing beneath the chandelier light, hearing her former mentor credit her openly before the most powerful people in the room, she realized compromise had slowly turned into erasure. Daniel's voice softened as he admitted that he had never stopped wondering what path she might have taken if circumstances had been different. Eleanor met his gaze with calm clarity. She did not answer immediately. She did not need to. In that elegant ballroom, surrounded by polished marble and crystal, the most significant transformation was invisible. It was the quiet recognition that her life had never been defined by the narrow roles she had accepted. And as the emblem bearing her original vision shimmered above them, she understood that the story of who she was had never truly belonged to anyone else. The energy in the ballroom shifted from curiosity to recalculation as Daniel's final words settled into the polished air, and Eleanor could almost feel the invisible scales tipping in real time. A senior partner standing nearby straightened his posture and addressed her directly for the first time that evening, asking about her background in design with a tone that carried genuine interest instead of polite dismissal. Others followed, forming a respectful semicircle, their earlier indifference replaced by careful attention. Richard attempted to insert himself back into the center of the conversation, laughing more loudly than necessary, and explaining how supportive he had always been of Eleanor's creativity, but his voice sounded slightly strained, as though he were speaking against the current rather than with it. Eleanor listened without correcting him. She did not contradict or expose. She simply allowed the contrast to speak for itself. Daniel asked her whether she had continued sketching over the years, and for a moment she hesitated, not out of shame, but out of reflection. She admitted that she had filled notebooks during quiet afternoons, drafting concepts that never left the kitchen table. She described how she would sometimes measure the dimensions of a room in their suburban home, imagining how light might be reframed through new lines or textures. The executives nodded thoughtfully, surprised by the depth beneath what they had assumed was a decorative presence. Richard glanced around, noticing the way heads leaned closer when Eleanor spoke. He attempted to rest his hand at the small of her back once more, this time more firmly, as if to signal ownership, but she stepped slightly forward, not dramatically, just enough to shift the physical dynamic. The gesture was subtle, yet unmistakable. Daniel smiled faintly, observing the movement with quiet understanding. He mentioned that Hayes Global was preparing to expand into a cultural arts initiative, funding urban revitalization projects in cities across the country, and he wondered aloud whether Eleanor might consider consulting, even informally at first. A hush fell over the nearby group. The offer was not theatrical. It was measured, practical, and entirely sincere. Eleanor felt Richard stiffen beside her. For years he had spoken about advancement as though it were a narrow ladder with room for only one climber. Now the possibility of her stepping onto a platform of her own unsettled him in ways he could not disguise. She did not accept immediately. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about the scope of the projects, the timelines, the intended communities. Her voice remained even, grounded in competence rather than emotion. The more she spoke, the more the room seemed to adjust its understanding of her role. What had begun as an evening where she was instructed to remain out of sight had evolved into a quiet reintroduction of who she had always been. Richard's earlier whisper echoed faintly in her memory, but it no longer held weight. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. The difference was that tonight, under the crystal light and the gaze of those who mattered professionally to her husband, the truth was no longer confined to her own quiet awareness. Daniel extended his hand once more, not in romance, not in nostalgia, but in professional respect. Eleanor accepted it calmly. Around them, conversations resumed, but with a new axis. The center had shifted, and everyone in the ballroom knew it. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, yet its meaning lingered long after their hands separated. Eleanor felt the subtle tremor of change settling into place, not dramatic, not loud, but steady and irreversible. Around them, executives resumed conversation with renewed interest, this time directing their questions toward her instead of around her. Richard's smile had become fixed, the kind worn at charity auctions when bids did not unfold as expected. He nodded along as Daniel spoke about future initiatives, occasionally interjecting with statements meant to align himself with the vision, but his tone lacked the confidence it carried earlier in the evening. Eleanor noticed the way he avoided meeting her eyes. For years she had adjusted her pace to match his ambitions, stepping back so he could appear taller in rooms like this. Tonight, she did not step back. She simply remained where she was. Daniel asked if she would be willing to meet the following week to discuss ideas more concretely. He suggested a lunch meeting at the firm's downtown office overlooking the river, offering specific dates and times with professional clarity. Eleanor considered the invitation thoughtfully. She did not look to Richard for approval. Instead, she responded with measured composure, suggesting Tuesday at noon and asking whether preliminary briefs could be sent in advance so she could review them thoroughly. Daniel agreed immediately, impressed not by nostalgia, but by competence. The conversation shifted naturally into logistics, and the crowd around them began to thin as others drifted back toward the dance floor. Richard cleared his throat and suggested that they should circulate, reminding Eleanor in a low voice that this was still his company event. She turned toward him calmly, her expression neither confrontational nor apologetic. She simply acknowledged his statement with a small nod, as though it were informational rather than directive. The difference unsettled him more than any argument could have. As they walked together across the ballroom, Eleanor became acutely aware of how differently the space felt compared to when she had entered. The chandeliers still shimmered, the orchestra still played, but she no longer felt positioned at the margins. Conversations paused when she approached, and several colleagues introduced themselves with genuine curiosity. Richard attempted to reclaim control by recounting anecdotes about his years at the firm, yet the attention did not fully return to him. Eleanor answered questions directly, speaking about design philosophy, about the importance of balancing structure with light, about how communities respond to spaces that respect both function and beauty. Her voice remained steady, grounded in lived experience rather than theory. Richard listened, his earlier whisper echoing faintly in his own memory now. The remark about her dress seemed trivial in comparison to the competence she displayed so effortlessly. As the evening progressed, Eleanor sensed that something fundamental had shifted between them. Not loudly, not publicly, but definitively. The role she had been assigned no longer fit, and for the first time in years, she did not feel compelled to shrink to accommodate it. By the time the orchestra shifted into a brighter arrangement and couples began moving toward the dance floor, Eleanor felt a quiet steadiness settle deep within her chest. The evening had not changed the marble walls or the crystal chandeliers, but it had altered the invisible geometry of her marriage. Richard walked beside her, his posture still upright, yet his movements carried a subtle stiffness, as if recalibrating in real time. Several colleagues approached once more, this time addressing Eleanor first, asking thoughtful questions about spatial branding, about community art initiatives in cities like Chicago and Seattle, about how design could influence corporate identity beyond a logo. She answered with calm clarity, referencing projects she had studied over the years, describing how even a 300-square-foot gallery space could feel expansive when light and line were balanced intentionally. Richard listened, nodding as though he had always known this depth existed. When someone complimented her insight, he forced a light laugh and said he had married well. The comment lingered in the air, half joke, half admission. Eleanor did not react outwardly. She simply held her glass of sparkling water and maintained steady eye contact with the speaker, allowing the conversation to continue without shrinking or deflecting praise. As the crowd thinned near the bar, Richard leaned closer and lowered his voice, attempting to sound casual. He remarked that he had not realized she had kept up with industry trends so closely, that perhaps she should have mentioned wanting to return to work sooner. The tone suggested revision rather than reflection. Eleanor considered his words carefully before responding. She explained that she had mentioned it several times over the years, often during quiet dinners or Sunday mornings, but that the timing had never seemed convenient. She did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the memory as fact. Richard fell silent. Across the room, Daniel was engaged in conversation with board members, yet his gaze occasionally returned in their direction, not possessively, but with professional respect. It was clear to anyone observing that Eleanor was no longer a decorative presence. She was a contributor. When the master of ceremonies took the stage to thank guests for attending and to introduce the company's new strategic direction, Daniel unexpectedly referenced the importance of original vision, crediting unnamed creative minds that had shaped the foundation long before the company achieved global status. Though he did not speak her name again, several heads turned subtly toward Eleanor in acknowledgement. Richard felt it. She felt it. The shift was undeniable. After the applause faded, Richard suggested they leave early, citing an early meeting the next morning. Eleanor glanced around the ballroom one last time, taking in the banners, the polished floor, the emblem that had once existed only on a sheet of tracing paper in a small Boston studio. She nodded calmly and walked toward the exit without hurry. Outside, the night air was crisp, the city skyline glowing in the distance. As the valet retrieved their car, Richard stood unusually quiet. For the first time in years, the silence between them did not feel like neglect. It felt like reckoning. And Eleanor understood that whatever happened next would no longer unfold in the shadow of someone else's ambition. The drive home unfolded in near silence, the city lights streaking softly across the windshield as Eleanor looked out at the familiar skyline with new awareness. Richard kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a way she recognized from years of boardroom tension. The radio remained off. The only sound inside the car was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional shift of tires against the pavement. Eleanor rested her hands calmly in her lap, her posture unchanged, her mind neither racing nor numb. She was thinking clearly for the first time in a long while. When they pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, the porch light cast a warm glow over the brick facade, the same house she had arranged and rearranged for decades, measuring rooms not in square feet, but in seasons of compromise. Richard cut the engine but did not immediately step out. He cleared his throat, as if preparing for a negotiation rather than a conversation. He remarked that the evening had taken an unexpected turn and that Daniel's public acknowledgement had surprised everyone. His tone carried an undercurrent of forced casualness. Eleanor turned toward him slowly and met his gaze without hostility. She agreed that it had been unexpected. She added, gently, that she had not known Daniel would be there, nor had she anticipated the direction the conversation would take. Richard nodded stiffly and mentioned that accepting a consulting opportunity might complicate things professionally. He spoke about optics, about office politics, about the importance of maintaining balance at home. Eleanor listened carefully. When he finished, she asked him what exactly he believed would be complicated. The question was simple. It was not sharp. It did not accuse. Yet it required clarity. Richard hesitated. He explained that colleagues might assume favoritism, that it could alter dynamics within his department. Eleanor absorbed his words and responded with measured calm. She pointed out that the offer had been made publicly, based on merit connected to a documented design origin. She reminded him that she had not sought the attention, it had come to her. The silence that followed was heavier than the one in the car. For years, Richard had been accustomed to her yielding in moments like this, smoothing over discomfort before it could form into conflict. Tonight she did not smooth. She did not escalate either. She simply held her ground. After a moment, Richard opened the car door and stepped out, circling to retrieve his jacket from the back seat. Eleanor remained seated for a few seconds longer, watching the soft light spill across their lawn. She realized that the true shift of the evening had not been Daniel's recognition or the whispered conversations in the ballroom. It had been internal. Something within her had realigned. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door without waiting to see if Richard followed. Inside, the house was quiet, the kitchen counters neatly arranged, the framed family photographs lining the hallway exactly where she had placed them years ago. She paused briefly in the foyer, glancing at the mirror above the console table. The navy dress was still elegant. The woman reflected there looked composed, not diminished. Richard entered behind her, setting his keys down with more force than necessary. He began to speak again about timing, about prudence, about how decisions should be made together. Eleanor listened, then answered with a calm certainty that surprised even her. She said that she would meet Daniel on Tuesday as discussed, that she intended to review the briefs carefully, and that she would decide based on her own professional judgment. Her voice did not waver. It did not rise. It carried simple authority. Richard fell silent, confronted not with anger, but with resolve. And in the quiet of their own home, far from crystal chandeliers and corporate banners, the most significant power shift of the night settled permanently into place. Tuesday arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze that carried the faint scent of the river through downtown streets. Eleanor parked her sedan in the visitor garage beneath Hayes Global's glass tower and paused for a moment before stepping out, not from doubt, but from awareness. She adjusted her blazer, a charcoal gray piece she had purchased years ago and rarely worn, and walked toward the revolving doors with steady composure. The lobby rose nearly 40 feet above her, sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows and reflecting off polished stone floors. She did not feel intimidated. She felt prepared. A receptionist greeted her by name and directed her to the executive floor where Daniel was already waiting. Inside the conference room overlooking the water, architectural renderings and proposal folders were neatly arranged across a 12-foot table. Daniel stood as she entered, offering a respectful handshake and a brief smile that carried professional warmth rather than nostalgia. They sat across from one another, and the conversation began without dramatics. He outlined the Cultural Arts Initiative in detail, explaining projected budgets, timelines measured in quarters rather than months, and partnerships planned in cities across the country. Eleanor listened attentively, asking specific questions about community engagement metrics and long-term sustainability. She studied the blueprints carefully, occasionally tracing the margins with her finger as she evaluated proportions and sight lines. The dialogue was balanced. Daniel spoke of opportunity. She spoke of execution. When he asked whether she would consider leading the design advisory segment on a contract basis, she did not hesitate. She stated clearly that she would accept under defined terms that preserved her independence and intellectual ownership. Daniel agreed without negotiation. As they finalized next steps, Eleanor felt no rush of triumph, only alignment. Later that afternoon, she returned home before Richard arrived from work. The house felt the same as it always had, yet she moved through it differently, placing her briefcase on the kitchen counter with quiet intention. When Richard walked in, he searched her expression for clues. She told him simply that she had accepted the consulting role. She did not frame it as defiance. She presented it as fact. Richard listened, absorbing the reality that the woman he had once asked to remain invisible now carried her own professional trajectory. He began to mention potential scheduling conflicts, but his tone lacked resistance. Something within him had adjusted as well. Over the following weeks, Eleanor divided her time between home and downtown meetings, reviewing renderings, attending site visits measured in square footage and elevation charts, rediscovering the language she had once spoken fluently. Her confidence did not return in a dramatic surge. It unfolded steadily, like light moving across a room at sunrise. At the next company gathering, Richard stood beside her without whispering instructions. He introduced her by name and by title. Eleanor did not seek validation in his voice. She had already found it in her own. The navy dress from that first evening remained in her closet, no longer a symbol of embarrassment, but of transformation. She understood now that visibility is not granted by permission. It is claimed by presence. And for the first time in decades, Eleanor Whitman was no longer standing in anyone's shadow.